They say the mountains don't change a man, they just strip away everything he's pretending to be. For Gideon McCall, a decade of freezing winters and silent summers in the Bitterroots had turned him into something tougher than the granite he walked on. He came down to the valley town of Owyhee Crossing for one simple reason. He needed a horse. He didn't want company, he didn't want trouble, and he certainly didn't want a family. But fate has a funny way of ignoring what a man wants. Sometimes the thing you're running from is exactly what you're riding toward. The autumn of 1883 came early to the high country, carrying a bitter chill that warned of a brutal winter ahead. Up near the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, the wind howled through the ponderosa pines like a dying animal. Gideon McCall sat by his small, smokeless fire, his massive hands wrapped around a battered tin mug of chicory coffee. At 36, Gideon looked like a man carved out of the landscape itself, hard-eyed, heavily bearded, with shoulders built broad by years of felling timber and trapping beaver. He was a solitary creature by choice. The war back east had taken his brothers, and a cholera outbreak in St. Louis had taken the woman he had once intended to marry. After that, humanity held no appeal for him. The mountains were cruel, but they were honest. If a bear mauled you, it was out of hunger or defense, not malice. If the cold froze your toes off, it was because you were foolish enough to let the fire die, not because the snow had a grudge against you. Men, however, were entirely unpredictable and infinitely treacherous. But a man couldn't survive the deep snows without a strong pack animal, and his old grey mule, Barnaby, had finally succumbed to age and a bad heart 3 days prior. Gideon had buried the loyal beast under a cairn of heavy stones to keep the wolves away, said a brief, gruff prayer, and packed his saddlebags. He needed a draft horse, something thick-boned and steady, to haul his winter traps and supplies up the treacherous winding trails. The trek down the mountain took him 2 full days. As the elevation dropped, the biting frost gave way to the crisp, golden air of the valley. The town of Owyhee Crossing sat on the edge of the river, a sprawling, chaotic frontier settlement bustling with miners, ranchers, and drifters. To Gideon, the noise was an assault on the senses. The clatter of wagon wheels, the shouting of merchants, and the stench of unwashed bodies and stale whiskey made his skin crawl. He pulled his wide-brimmed Stetson lower over his eyes, keeping his Winchester rifle resting casually but deliberately in the crook of his arm. He didn't stop at the saloons or the general store. He made a beeline for the livery stable. The stable master, a balding, nervous man named Henry Cobb, took one look at Gideon's towering frame, his bear hide coat, and the cold, grey intensity of his eyes, and swallowed hard. "Help you, stranger?" Cobb asked, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Need a horse?" Gideon's voice was a low rumble, rough like 2 stones grinding together. "Pack animal. Big. Don't care if it's pretty, just needs to carry weight and not spook at a shadow." Cobb shook his head slowly. "Picked a bad week, mister. Rufus Carmichael bought up near every decent head of stock in the valley for his logging operation. Only thing I got left is a sway-backed mare that wouldn't make it halfway up a foothill." Gideon's jaw tightened. There has to be someone selling. Cobb looked around nervously, lowering his voice. "Well, There's the Higgins place, out on the north bend of the river. Clara Higgins, widow woman. She's got a few good draft crosses left, but you didn't hear it from me. Carmichael's been trying to starve her out to get her land. Anyone does business with her tends to find themselves on the wrong end of Carmichael's temper. Gideon stared at the man for a long, silent moment. I ain't afraid of a local bully, he finally said, turning on his heel. Obliged. As he walked the 3 miles out of town toward the north bend, the dust of the road clinging to his worn leather boots, Gideon felt a strange pull in his chest. He just wanted a horse. He wanted to make a clean transaction, load up on flour and salt, and disappear back into the silent timber before the first snow fell. He had no intention of getting tangled in a local land dispute. But as he crested the hill and saw the Higgins ranch sprawling below, fate began to thread the needle of a completely different destiny. The Higgins ranch had once been a beautiful piece of land, nestled into a gentle curve of the river. The soil was rich and the grazing grass grew high. But as Gideon walked through the front gate, the signs of a desperate, losing battle were everywhere. The split-rail fences were broken in several places, clumsily patched with rope and barbed wire. The barn roof sagged dangerously, missing several shingles. In the center of the corral stood a woman, Clara Higgins. Gideon paused by the gate, watching her. She was covered in a layer of fine dust. Her calico dress faded from years of harsh lye soap and relentless sun. A stray lock of auburn hair had escaped her loose braid, falling across a face that was sharp with exhaustion, but undeniably striking. She was trying to wrangle a massive, restless blue roan gelding, pulling on the lead rope with every ounce of her strength. Her boots dug into the dirt, but the horse tossed its massive head, lifting her slightly off the ground. Before Gideon could announce himself, the back door of the small farmhouse banged open. 5 children spilled out like water from a broken dam. "Ma!" Tommy dropped the flour sack, yelled the oldest, a boy of about 14, practically vibrating with anxious energy. His name was Jeb, and he carried the heavy burden of being the man of the house poorly on his scrawny shoulders. Behind him came a girl of 12, Sarah, carrying a crying toddler on her hip. 2 more boys, Will and Mary, no older than 9 and 6, trailed behind, covered in what looked like a mixture of mud and baking flour. "Jeb, please just sweep it up," Clara called back, her voice strained as the roan pulled violently to the left. "I can't let go of Buster right now." The horse reared, its hooves flashing dangerously close to Clara's head. She cried out, losing her grip on the rope and stumbling backward into the dirt. The horse snorted, preparing to bolt toward the broken section of the fence. Gideon didn't think. He just moved. He vaulted the unbroken section of the corral fence with a fluid grace surprising for a man his size. He landed softly in the dirt and stepped directly into the horse's path. He didn't wave his arms or shout. Instead, he stood perfectly still, raised one large hand, and emitted a low, sharp whistle, followed by a series of deep, calming clicks from the back of his throat. The blue roan froze, its ears swiveling toward the strange, towering man in the bear hide coat. Gideon took a slow, deliberate step forward, keeping his eyes entirely on the animal. He reached out and caught the trailing lead rope, sliding his hand up to the halter. He exhaled a long, slow breath, and miraculously, the massive beast lowered its head, letting out a heavy sigh that mirrored the mountain man's. The corral fell dead silent. Even the crying toddler, Tommy, stopped mid-sob to stare. Gideon turned his attention to the woman in the dirt. He walked over, the now docile horse trailing behind him, and offered her a large, calloused hand. Clara looked at his hand, then up at his face. Her emerald eyes were wide, a mixture of fear and profound exhaustion swimming in them. Slowly, she reached up. Her hand was rough and blistered, a testament to the endless labor she endured. Gideon pulled her to her feet with effortless ease. "Obliged, mister," Clara breathed, dusting off her skirt, trying to compose herself. She stepped slightly in front of her children, a protective, maternal instinct flaring up. "You gave us a fright. We don't get many visitors out this way, least not friendly ones." "Name's Gideon McCall," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Stable master in town said you might have a draft horse for sale. Looks like this one's got the bone and the temper for heavy pulling. If you're selling..." Clara looked at Buster, then back at Gideon. A heavy sadness washed over her face. "Buster is the best we have left. I didn't want to sell him. But my husband, he passed a year ago. Things have been hard. The bank is calling in notes and, well, we need the money more than we need the plow power right now." Gideon nodded slowly. He took in the sight of the family, a widow and 5 children, 6 souls clinging to the edge of the world, surrounded by predators. He knew the look of starvation. He'd seen it in the hollows of the children's cheeks and the frayed edges of their clothes. "I have gold," Gideon said flatly. "I'll pay a fair price." $50, Clara gasped. $50 was astronomical, almost double what the horse was worth. "Mr. McCall, that's too much. I can't take charity." "Ain't charity," Gideon replied, running a hand down the roan's muscular neck. "A good horse is the difference between life and death where I live. He's worth 50 to me." For a moment, a glimmer of hope sparked in Clara's eyes. It was the first time in 12 months she saw a way to buy enough winter provisions to keep her children fed. But before she could agree, the sound of thundering hooves echoed down the dirt road. Jeb's face went pale. "Ma, it's Boyd Travers." 3 riders kicked up a cloud of choking dust as they yanked their horses to a halt just outside the Higgins broken gate. The leader was Boyd Travers, Rufus Carmichael's chief enforcer. He was a mean-looking man with a badly scarred upper lip and a habit of keeping his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his Colt revolver. Boyd leaned over his saddle horn, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt. He didn't even look at Gideon, dismissing him as some wandering drifter. His predatory gaze locked entirely on Clara. "Morning, Widow Higgins," Boyd drawled, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Mr. Carmichael sent me out here to check on you, seeing as how your fences are falling down and your stock looks half-starved. He's offering $300 for the deed to this dust bowl. Generous, considering the state of it." Clara stiffened, her chin lifting in defiance. "You tell Rufus Carmichael the price is the same as it was yesterday, and the day before. I'm not selling. This land belongs to my children." Boyd chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Now, Clara, You're being unreasonable. Winter's coming. How are you going to feed these brats? Be a shame if a fire accidentally started in that dry old barn of yours, or if the rest of your horses just wandered off. Jeb stepped forward, picking up a heavy pitchfork. You stay away from our property, Travers, the 14-year-old shouted, though his hands were shaking violently. Boyd's eyes narrowed. In a flash, he drew his revolver and aimed it squarely at the boy's chest. Put it down, kid, before I make your mother a widow and a mourner. Clara screamed, lunging forward, but before she could take 2 steps, a shadow eclipsed her. Gideon had moved with a terrifying, silent speed. He didn't draw his rifle or raise his voice. He simply stepped between the barrel of Boyd's gun and the trembling boy. Gideon stared up at the man on the horse. The mountain man's eyes were dead, devoid of any warmth or fear. It was the look of a grizzly bear watching a wolf approach its kill. Put the iron away, boy, Gideon said softly. Boyd blinked, genuinely taken aback by the sheer size and presence of the man. Who the hell are you? Step aside, mountain trash. This ain't your business. I just bought a horse from this lady, Gideon replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the tense air. That makes me a customer, and I don't like people threatening folks I do business with. It ruins the transaction. You want a bullet, drifter? Boyd sneered, pulling the hammer back on his Colt with a loud click. Gideon didn't flinch. He slowly unbuttoned the top button of his heavy coat. You pull that trigger. You better kill me true, because if I'm still breathing when I hit the dirt, I'm going to pull you off that saddle, and I'm going to break your neck with my bare hands. The sheer, chilling conviction in Gideon's voice made the 2 men flanked beside Boyd nervously shift their horses. They were used to intimidating sodbusters and frightened widows, not men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast. Boyd hesitated. He looked at the massive breadth of Gideon's shoulders, the heavily scarred knuckles resting by his sides, and the complete absence of fear in his eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, Boyd eased the hammer down and holstered his weapon. You're making a mistake, stranger, Boyd spat. Carmichael runs this valley. You just bought yourself a ticket to an early grave. I've died a few times already, Gideon said evenly. Didn't take. Now get off this land. Boyd yanked his horse's reins, turning the animal sharply. We'll be back, Clara. You can't hide behind a stray dog forever. He kicked his spurs in, and the 3 men galloped away, leaving a thick cloud of dust in their wake. Gideon watched them until they disappeared over the ridge, his body remaining tense for a full minute before he finally relaxed his shoulders. He turned around to find Clara and her 5 children staring at him with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. Clara was trembling now, the adrenaline fading to leave behind a cold sweat. She covered her face with her dirt-stained hands, a single, muffled sob escaping her lips. Gideon felt completely out of his depth. If a man was bleeding, he knew how to stitch him. If a horse was lame, he knew how to shoe it. But a weeping woman and 5 terrified children. He was hopelessly lost. He awkwardly stepped forward, taking his hat off and crushing it in his hands. Mom, they're gone. You're safe. Clara lowered her hands, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked at Gideon. really looked at him. Safe. Mr. McCall, you just signed your own death warrant. And ours. They've been cutting our fences, poisoning our water. But they've never pulled a gun on my children before. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to an anguished whisper. My husband didn't just pass a year ago. His wagon didn't accidentally slip off the logging trail. Carmichael's men ran him off the cliff because he refused to sell the timber rights. I have no proof. The sheriff is in Carmichael's pocket. And now I don't know what to do. Gideon looked at the worn-down woman. He looked at young Jeb, who was still holding the pitchfork, trying so desperately to be brave. He looked at little Tommy, who was clutching his mother's skirt. Gideon closed his eyes, thinking of the cold, silent sanctuary of his mountain cabin. He thought of the peace of the heavy snowfall, the absolute isolation where no one's problems could touch him. All he had to do was hand her the $50, take the blue roan, and walk away. It wasn't his fight. It wasn't his family. He opened his eyes. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around the broken corral. $50 is a lot of money, Gideon said slowly, placing his hat back on his head. And this blue roan, he's a bit too spirited for a mountain trail just yet. I reckon he needs some training before I take him up. Clara looked confused. Training? Yes, ma'am, Gideon said, turning his gaze toward the ridge where Boyd had disappeared. I reckon it'll take me about a week to break him proper. If you don't mind, I'll sleep in the barn. In exchange for the room and board, I'll fix your fences. And he paused, his jaw setting into a hard line. I'll keep an eye on the road. Clara's breath hitched. She saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't staying to train the horse. He was staying to stand between her family and the wolves. Mr. McCall, she whispered, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. You don't have to do this. I know, Gideon replied softly. He walked over to Buster, took the lead rope, and started leading the horse toward the barn. Come on, Jeb, he called out over his shoulder. Put the pitchfork away. You're going to help me mix some oats. The boy's eyes lit up, and he scurried after the giant mountain man. Clara stood in the yard, surrounded by her remaining children, watching the broad back of the stranger who had just walked out of the wilderness and decided to hold back the storm. The week that followed brought a strange, fragile peace to the Higgins ranch, though the shadow of Rufus Carmichael loomed over every sunrise. Gideon McCall did not sleep in the farmhouse. True to his word, he took up residence in the drafty barn, making a bed of fresh hay and old wool blankets near Buster's stall. But his presence was felt in every corner of the property. By dawn of the second day, the rhythmic, booming sound of a heavy sledgehammer echoed across the river valley. Gideon had waded into the freezing shallows of the Owyhee River to drag out massive, waterlogged cedar trunks that had washed down from the high country during the spring melt. Stripped to his thermal undershirt, his broad shoulders straining against the impossible weight, he hauled the timber up the bank and began replacing the rotted, broken fence posts. He didn't just fix the corral, he fortified it, sinking the posts a full 3 feet into the hardpan dirt and securing them with heavy iron carriage bolts he'd purchased in town with his own gold. The children, initially terrified of the towering, silent man, slowly began to orbit him like moths drawn to a heavy iron lantern. Little Mary, only 6 years old, was the first to break the ice. On the third afternoon, while Gideon was sharpening his heavy hunting knife on a wet stone, she waddled over, entirely ignoring the lethal-looking blade, and handed him a slightly squashed wild dandelion. Gideon stopped his work. He looked at the tiny, fragile yellow flower, then down at the little girl covered in flour and dirt. Slowly, his massive, scarred fingers reached out and took the weed by its stem with the utmost care, as if he were handling spun glass. He tucked it into the leather band of his Stetson. Mary beamed, missing a front tooth, and ran back to the house. From the kitchen window, Clara watched the exchange, her hands still deep in a bowl of bread dough. A strange, tight knot in her chest slowly beginning to unravel. For Clara, Gideon was a mystery wrapped in a bear hide coat. He spoke little, but his actions deafened her with their kindness. He fixed the sagging barn roof. He chopped a cord of firewood in a single afternoon, leaving it neatly stacked by the back door. He even spent an evening showing young Jeb how to properly break down, oil, and reassemble a Winchester rifle, teaching the boy that a weapon was a tool for preservation, not a toy for pride. But it was on the fifth night that the unspoken bond between Gideon and Clara shifted from gratitude into something deeper. The children were asleep, and a cold, biting wind had swept down from the bitterroots, rattling the window panes. Clara walked out to the barn, carrying a plate of hot venison stew and a mug of coffee. She found Gideon sitting by the open barn door, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the moonlit road leading into town. "You don't have to stand guard every night, Mr. McCall," Clara said softly, handing him the plate. "You're exhausting yourself." "A wolf doesn't hunt when the sun is up, ma'am," Gideon replied, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet barn. He accepted the food, his knuckles briefly brushing against hers. The contact was fleeting, but Clara felt a sudden, shocking warmth spread up her arm. She sat on an overturned nail keg beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You've done more for us in 5 days than anyone in Oihe Crossing has done in a year. Why? A man like you. You belong up there." She pointed toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks in the distance, where it's quiet. Gideon ate in silence for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the road. "I went up there to forget," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of old, heavy stones. "Lost my brothers at Shiloh. Lost my bride to the sickness in St. Louis. I figured if I stayed away from people, I couldn't lose anything else. The mountains don't ask you for anything you can't give them." He turned to look at her, the moonlight catching the silver strands in his thick beard and the profound sorrow in his grey eyes. "But looking at you, Clara, looking at Jeb and Mary and the rest of them, it made me realize that living just to not lose anything ain't really living at all. It's just waiting to die." Clara's breath hitched. She reached out, her rough, blistered hand resting over his massive, calloused one. "My husband, Thomas, he was a good man. But when he died, the whole world turned its back on us. I thought I had to fight the whole world alone." "You don't," Gideon whispered. "Not anymore. The tender moment was violently shattered by the sudden, panicked whinny of Buster. Gideon was on his feet in a microsecond, the plate of stew clattering to the floor. He blew out the barn lantern with one swift breath, plunging them into darkness. "Get back to the house," he hissed, shoving the Winchester into her hands. "Lock the door. Do not come out unless you hear me call your name." "Gideon." "What?" "Go." Clara ran. Gideon sprinted in the opposite direction, melting into the shadows of the corral just as 3 riders crested the ridge, silhouetted against the moonlight. They were holding torches, the flames licking hungrily at the night air. It was Boyd Travers and 2 of Carmichael's hired guns coming to make good on their threat to burn the widow out. "Light up the barn first," Boyd shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. "Let the horses burn. That'll teach the bitch to defy Mr. Carmichael." One of the riders spurred his horse forward, rearing his arm back to hurl the pitch-soaked torch onto the dry cedar shingles. He never threw it. From the darkness of the riverbank, a thick hemp rope snapped taut across the rider's chest. Gideon had rigged a tripwire between 2 heavy cottonwood trees earlier that afternoon. The horse galloped forward, but the rider was clotheslined, violently ripped from his saddle. He hit the hard-packed dirt with a sickening thud, the torch flying from his hand and sizzling out in a mud puddle. "What the hell?" Boyd yelled, drawing his Colt. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the yard. The remaining 2 horses danced nervously, their eyes rolling white. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the side of the barn. Gideon didn't use a gun. The sound of a gunshot would wake the children and draw the corrupt town sheriff. Instead, he moved with the brutal, silent efficiency of a mountain predator. He grabbed the second rider by the heavy leather of his gun belt, hauled him bodily off his horse, and drove a fist the size of a ham hock into the man's jaw. The crack of bone was loud, and the man went limp instantly. Boyd panicked. He aimed his revolver blindly into the shadows and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot deafened the night, but the bullet only buried itself in a wooden post. Before Boyd could cock the hammer again, Gideon's hand clamped over the cylinder of the gun, jamming it. With his other hand, Gideon grabbed Boyd by the throat and yanked him down, slamming him back first onto the wooden water trough. Water splashed everywhere as Gideon leaned over the gasping enforcer, his forearm pressing crushing weight against Boyd's windpipe. "I told you," Gideon whispered, his face inches from Boyd's, his voice colder than the river water. "I don't like people ruining my transactions." Boyd gagged, his hands feebly clawing at Gideon's immovable arm. "You listen to me, you piece of filth," Gideon growled. "You ride back to Rufus Carmichael. You tell him that the widow Higgins is under the protection of Gideon McCall. You tell him if he sends another man to this property, I won't leave them breathing. And if he has a problem with that, he can come face me himself in the daylight. Nod, if you understand." Boyd nodded frantically, his eyes bulging. Gideon released him, stepping back. Boyd scrambled off the trough, coughing violently, and hoisted himself onto his horse. His 2 unconscious companions were slowly groaning in the dirt. "Take your trash with you," Gideon ordered. It took Boyd 5 minutes to drag his battered men onto their horses. He glared at Gideon, blood dripping from his scarred lip. You're a dead man, McCall. Carmichael owns the judge, the sheriff, and the dirt you're standing on. You can't fight an empire. I don't need to fight an empire, Gideon said, wiping the mud from his hands. I just need to break its knees. The morning sun brought no warmth to the Higgins ranch. It hung in the pale autumn sky like a cold, indifferent eye, watching as Gideon McCall prepared the homestead for a war he knew was inevitable. He gathered the family in the cramped kitchen, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and raw fear. He held a folded piece of heavy parchment, the ink on the inside barely dry. He knelt down to look Jeb directly in the eye. The 14-year-old boy was trembling, but his chin was thrust out in stubborn defiance. Jeb, Gideon said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the boy's panic. I need you to saddle Buster. He's massive and he's mean, but he's the only animal fast enough with the stamina to make a hard run to the rail station at Silver City. You stay off the main road. Keep to the timber line. Jeb swallowed hard. What do I do when I get to Silver City, Mr. McCall? You find the telegraph operator. You send this exact message to Territorial Governor John Schuyler Crosby in Boise. You tell the operator it's from First Lieutenant Gideon McCall of the 3rd Infantry, and you make sure they transmit this code word at the bottom. The governor and I spilled blood together at Gettysburg. When he sees this, he'll send the federal marshals. Carmichael owns the local badge, but he cannot buy the United States government. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, astonishment briefly overriding her terror. A first lieutenant? You were an officer? A lifetime ago, Gideon murmured, his eyes darkening with ghost he rarely let surface. He gripped Jeb's shoulder. Ride like the devil himself is chasing you, son. Because he is. As Jeb tore out of the yard on the massive blue roan, galloping toward the safety of the northern ridge, Gideon went to work. He dragged heavy cast-iron farm implements to blockade the front gate. He stacked cords of wood high against the porch to create shooting blinds. And he handed Clara his heavy, double-barreled stagecoach shotgun. He led her and the 4 younger children down into the dark, damp root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards. If anyone but me opens these cellar doors, Gideon instructed, his grey eyes locking onto Clara's with intense, terrifying severity. You point this up, and you pull both triggers. You do not hesitate. Clara dropped the shotgun to her side, reached up, and grabbed Gideon by the heavy collar of his flannel shirt. She pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with a desperate, fierce passion that tasted of tears and the bitter dust of the valley. You come back to this cellar, Gideon McCall, she whispered fiercely. You hear me? Do not leave me alone in this world again. I ain't going anywhere, Clara, he swore, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in a decade. At high noon, the horizon turned brown. A massive cloud of choking dust signaled their approach. Rufus Carmichael rode at the front of a column of 20 heavily armed mercenaries, flanked by the corrupt Sheriff Horace Blanton. Carmichael, a bloated, wealthy timber baron sweating in a fine wool suit, halted his prize stallion 50 yards from the barricaded gate. McCall, Carmichael's voice boomed over the silent, waiting yard. I know you're in there. I hold a legal eviction notice signed by Judge Amos Pettigrew. The bank has foreclosed. Surrender the property, and I'll let you and the